Over on Substack, the Unsolicited Advice reading group is currently reading Kierkegaard's The Present Age. If you'd like to join us, the link is in the description. Right, Alex O'Connor, welcome to Solicited Advice, the show that you named.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's obvious, isn't it? I mean, like, I said to some people, Joe's starting a podcast. You know what it should be called, right? And they're like, oh, yeah, maybe. And I'm like, no. Like, just think about it for like 2 seconds. What should he call his podcast? And it just jumps out at you. It writes itself.
It does make sense, It's because this time people have asked someone to be here, which is in contrast to my sort of ejaculations out into the void. But anyway.
Yeah, nice. I mean, I can't imagine people must be dying to see us together because it so rarely happens that we get on camera together. You have been very generous coming on my show a number of times, and people are always very excited about it. So it's nice to do things the other way around.
Oh, that's very kind. It's always good fun. And without further ado, I mean, the first question is quite relevant. We've known one another for a couple of years now, and you've been doing philosophy YouTube in some capacity for like around 10 years now. Is that right? Must be coming up to 10 years.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, which is
pretty much
mental. In that time, how many of your viewpoints have changed? Because, of course, initially when you started, you were known as a sort of new atheist or new atheist adjacent figure, and that's clearly shifted over time. But
yeah.
I'm just interested to see what other positions have changed in the intervening 10 years. I mean, you used to be like a hardcore physicalist, and that's clearly shifted too.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Like, I do talk a lot about how I sort of used to be a new atheist, and I've spoken about that so much that it's almost gotten boring. Not for me. I mean, for anybody who must be listening, like they get it. But there are other things going on too, and as you point to, one of the most important things, specifically since I've met you, so in the past few years, is, I suppose, my views on materialism and physicalism. There's sort of a bit of dispute as to what term to use, right? Because we don't really know what material is, and there's physicalism and there's naturalism. But we're kind of talking about the view that the universe is like made of stuff, like inanimate, I don't know, maybe atoms. If they're not atoms, maybe they're like vibrating strings, or like localized collapsings of wave functions or whatever. And that this is sort of what the universe is made out of. It's not so much that I've given up on the received wisdom that is what the universe is made out of, but come to realize that nobody actually knows anything about the nature of what we're talking about. Like, we are, when it gets down to at least the subatomic level, I think we are in the same position as like the ancient Greek philosophers sat around going like, I just feel like it might be water. I just feel like water's kind of got something to do with it. No, maybe like it all comes from fire. Didn't the Stoics think it all kind of came from fire? Like that kind of thing. We're kind of doing the same thing at the quantum level, because we've got all of this wonder. Don't get me wrong. I'm not here to disparage the scientific method. I think it is wonderful and crucial and beautiful, and we antagonize it at our peril. But on the philosophical point of the stuff we're actually dealing with, once we get down to that atomic level, we are doing a lot of guesswork. Not to say that scientists are saying things they don't know, but they are just quite openly saying, like, we don't really know how to think of like what an electron is, whether it is a cloud of probability, whether it is a particle or a wave or a sort of pocket of energy or something. And so, I don't know, it's quite an exciting time in the history of science that these fundamental questions of what stuff is actually made out of are kind of re-emerging as we begin to realize that the world literally beneath our feet is insanely weird, and much more weird than anything on the macro scale.
It is very, very interesting. In fact, this idea of like what is quantum stuff, and whether it should even be a question worth asking, dates right back to the advent of quantum physics. I can't remember the name of the guy, so I will pop it up in post. But in a paper by Arthur Fine, he talks about this physicist who, way back in the 1920s, who basically spent all his time warning his graduate students not to worry about what quantum physics actually means and to just stick to the equations, which is one of those attitudes which kind of appeals to me because, as people might be aware, because I bang on about it all the time, I'm a little bit more pragmatist in my metaphilosophical leanings. But there is the question of whether that answers what the nature of stuff is, what things there are. You sometimes put it as what a thing is rather than what a thing does. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this is a crucial distinction. And what you're pointing to is the so-called shut up and calculate approach, right, which is associated with the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. That's a lot of words. When we started realizing that the quantum world is extremely weird, we started getting all of these results from things like the double slit experiment, which most people are aware of, which sort of seems to mean that a particle can act like a particle or a wave depending on various factors, like whether you're observing it, that kind of stuff. It's all very weird. And so there are basically these different interpretations of the data, like what is really going on here. And in my view, the Copenhagen interpretation is not even really an interpretation of what's going on. It is just this shut up and calculate approach. It just means that as long as we have a mathematical model that accurately describes the data that we're seeing, then if we just treat this mathematical model as if it's true, then we're going to be able to do productive things. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's fine. For example, a subatomic particle is like everywhere all at once until you observe it with sort of different probabilistic, sort of different probabilities of being in particular areas. But it is, in fact, in all of these places all at once. And when you observe it, they say the wave function, which is this probability distribution, collapses, and suddenly the particle's in one place. Now, if you treat that as though it's true, you can do a lot of great maths and physics, right? And that's wonderful. But the mistake that's being made is confusing this methodological assumption for an ontological one, which is to say about the nature of stuff, is to say that, no, actually, I think there really is a cloud of probability that collapses when you observe it. Anybody who has the Copenhagen interpretation as like a metaphysic, I think is making a category error. As I like to say, you can't spell Copenhagen interpretation without cope. I think it's literally a case of sort of going, look, we have no idea what's going on. This is a mathematical model that works, so let's just run with it. Alternatives you might have heard of, so like the many worlds interpretation is another competitor for an interpretation of the data. The reason why we sort of need to treat all of these different options as real is because they are real. And not in the sense that there's a cloud of probability, but in the sense that there are like, almost infinitely many different branches of reality. It's not a multiverse like, strictly speaking, sort of little blobby universes in some ether somewhere. It's like every time a thing can happen, reality kind of splits off into all of these different possibilities. I spoke to David Deutsch at length about this. He's very confident that this is the real nature of reality. But the thing I'm trying to get across is that this calculation approach is what mathematicians and physicists do so well and do so brilliantly, is they come up with incredible mathematical systems that describe the universe and which can be used to do wonderful things. But that doesn't mean we've actually understood the nature of things. I always like to point to the example of Isaac Newton, because quantum mechanics is a bit complicated. Keeping it more simple, Newton discovers gravity, right? Mm-hmm. It is worth reflecting on what it is that Newton actually discovered. People knew that objects fell to the ground long before Newton did, right? The question is, well, what's going on here, And Newton famously kind of looks at the moon and thinks, is the moon also falling? And he, brilliantly answers, yes, it is. And he suddenly realizes that actually what's happening is the moon is constantly falling towards the Earth, but it's just missing the Earth because it's moving sideways. And so it kind of keeps falling towards it, but missing it, and falling towards it and missing it. And that's how you get orbit. And so Newton realizes that the same thing that keeps the planets in orbit is the same thing that makes objects fall to the ground. And then he sets about mathematically describing this. And he comes up with the inverse square law. The further something is away, if it's 2 times as far away, then it's, minus 4 times as strong, this strength. And he says there's this thing called gravity, which is the label he gives to whatever this thing is that's keeping all of this together, right? And brilliant. And now we can send rockets to the moon. Awesome. Thank you, Newton. But Newton, as I like to point out, explicitly in the Scholium to the second edition of the Principia Mathematica, writes, as for what this gravity thing is, hypothesis non fingo, he writes. I frame no hypothesis. He's saying he doesn't know. He doesn't know what gravity is. He doesn't he's just sort of coming up with a mathematical description and thinking, well, if we just treat it as though there is this force that works in this mathematical way, everything works, right? And guess what? It does. But most people know, at least to some degree, that Newton was wrong, right? Because Einstein comes along and like a century later and is like, however long later, and says, actually, that's not what gravity is. It's a bending of space-time kind of thing. So Newton's maths worked, and there's no reason why we shouldn't be glad that he had this system, which when treated as though true, allowed us to do all kinds of stuff. But it wasn't actually accurate in terms of describing the nature of the universe. And I think a lot of what's happening in like quantum mechanics, and this is uncontroversial, by the way. This isn't like me coming in and saying, you quantum like a lot of people will say this. I'll be like, yeah, I mean, that's all we're doing is we're sort of mathematically trying to model the world, and that's fine. But if you're a philosopher, you're going to want to know, well, what's actually happening, not just how to describe it. And of course, as you said as well, it means that scientists are only really telling you what things do. They're not telling you what things are. At the most fundamental level, at least, a scientist just doesn't really have the lexicon to tell you what a thing actually is. So even if you ask them a trivial question like, what is a table made out of? They might tell you, well, it's made out of wood. And that's all very well and good. But if you don't know what wood is, then you're going to ask them, well, what's wood? And they're going to describe some kind of chemical composition, which I do not know. And then you ask them, yeah, but what's that? What is that thing? What is that made out of? They say, oh, well, it's made out of atoms. Okay, what's that? Well, protons and electrons. Okay, well, like, what is an electron? Well, it's kind of a fundamental particle. Okay, but like, what is it? Well, it's a negatively charged particle. Okay, what's negative charge? They'll tell you what it does. They won't tell you what it is. And not out of not out of spite or anything. They just can't. All of the fundamental physical sort of qualities of the world, mass, charge, all that kind of stuff, are all defined in terms of what they do. Like mass is often defined in terms of resistance to acceleration, which is like, cool, but what is it? What? Like, I can touch it. It's here. Like, what is this stuff that I'm engaging with right now? I'm not engaging with resistance to acceleration. Well, I am, because if I push this microphone, it resists acceleration a bit. Okay, that's useful. Cool, I can use that. But what is it? What is the thing that's resisting acceleration? And science just doesn't have the language to answer that. And that's not to say that we've got this like spooky supernatural thing going on. It's just to say that when the scientific method decided that mathematics is the language of the universe, as Galileo famously had it, it basically just like a priori just ruled out the existence or truth of anything which cannot be described mathematically. I think there are definitely things that can't be described mathematically. In particular, when it comes to consciousness, I don't think you can capture consciousness in the language of science and maths. So you've kind of got two options. You either say Galileo was right, and therefore consciousness, I guess, just either doesn't exist or is somehow reducible to the physical stuff of the universe. Or you say, no, there's nothing like spooky or like weird about consciousness. It's just another thing that exists in the universe. But Galileo was wrong to say that the scientific method is the way to approximate it. Now, people will say, I'm going on a bit of a rant here. People will say, okay, but like, when can you ever say what something is? All we need is to say what things sort of do, and that allows us to sort of navigate the universe. Yes, if you're a scientist, in the same way that if I was talking to a chess grandmaster, and I sort of lift and slightly adapt this example from my friend Philip Goff, if I was talking to a chess grandmaster and I wanted to learn how to win chess, right? So I say, like, what is a chessboard made out of? And it goes, well, it's made out of, pawns and major pieces and minor pieces. Okay, cool. Well, what are major pieces made out of? And what are major pieces? They're like bishops and horses, right? I think those are the.
I know. We've played
ones.
chess twice, and you completely thrashed me both times because I'm terrible at it.
Well, I should have looked this up beforehand. I'm pretty sure that the major pieces refers to like bishops and knights, maybe also rooks. I'm not sure. Anyway, and then you say, okay, well, what's a bishop? And as a chess grandmaster, the most helpful way you can answer and truthful way you can answer is, well, a bishop is a piece that only legally moves diagonally across the board. Okay, cool. And then I sort of say, yeah, but what is it? What is a bishop? You'd be like, well, what do you mean? They're like, that's it. Like, we're playing chess. That's all a bishop is. It's defined by like what it does. You just play a game and this is how it moves. It's like, okay, fine. And then I could play chess and I could win. And it doesn't matter what you use as a bishop. You could use, an AirPods case or something. And as long as you know the rules of how it moves, you can play chess. And that's great if you're a chess player. But if like I'm that kid's dad who's trying to learn chess, and I'm a carpenter and I want to make him a chess set for his birthday. And so I go, hey son, what's that thing you're playing with? Oh, it's a chess set. Okay, well, can you just tell me what's it made out of? It's like, oh, major pieces and minor pieces. Oh, cool. Oh, this bishop then. What's this bishop made out of? What are you talking about? Well, I mean, what literally, what's the stuff? What's the thing you're moving with your hand? Because I'd quite like to go and, build one for you. And the son goes, well, it's just a piece that moves diagonally legally. And he'd be like, okay, but I feel like you haven't fully answered my question here. And the son goes, no, but my grandmaster told me like, that's all there is. That's all you need to know. It's like, that's true in the context of chess. And similarly, you maybe knowing what an electron does, knowing what, spin and charge and mass and all that kind of stuff does is all you need in the context of science, in the context of like practical reality, which in fairness is the reality that most people live in. So no problem. But if you are actually just still interested in what stuff really is made out of in the context of philosophy or metaphysics, I don't think it's enough, man. I want to know what's actually there.
I mean, it's a fair enough question. I suppose, because I think it might help bring out the contrast a little bit better. Can you give an example of something that you think we do have a description of what it is? Just so like we can bring out this contrast between what something is and what it does.
Unfortunately, this is where it seems to get a bit question-beggy. But to clarify, as a throat clearing, the reason why I'm bringing this up is not to say there's some kind of gap with physics and let's plug it in with consciousness. It's rather for me to point out, like, to make a sort of cumulative case, that it seems to me that if you actually want to know with certainty what a thing actually is, there might only actually be one such thing in the universe, which is phenomenology, which is experience, right? And to the extent, and it's kind of like this polarization is so interesting because the stuff that you can mathematize, like mass and charge and all that kind of stuff, is the stuff that you sort of don't know what it is. But the stuff that you do know what it is the stuff that you can't like mathematize and scientifically describe. So famously, people have spent a long time trying to scientifically account for or describe phenomenological experience and failed. And yet, if I ask you what it like is to experience, you know what I'm talking about. You don't just know what your experience like sort of does. You don't just know that like when you see the color red, you associate it with stop. You don't just know that. You know what it's like to experience redness. You just know that directly, right? As direct experience. And so when you ask, is there something that we know for what it is? I think any kind of phenomenological experience, that is, anything you hear, anything you see, anything you touch, anything you feel, any kind of emotional state that you can only best describe through analogy and poetry, that is you interacting with something as it is. And that's the very reason why we struggle so much to put it into descriptive words, because that's just when you experience something so directly, especially if that's kind of the only way it can be known. It's very difficult to communicate that to another person who doesn't already know what you're talking about. Like I can tell you that my jeans are blue, and you'll know what I'm talking about, but only because you've also had that private isness of the experience of blue. Trivially, if I tried to tell a blind person that my jeans were blue, they would say, okay, what does that mean? And if you ask blind people how they understand color, they're like, well, I kind of think I get it, because people talk about how like it's associated with sadness and how the ocean is blue and stuff like that, but they don't know what it is. And they kind of start to sound a little bit like a scientist. They tell you the effect that blueness has in the world without being able to tell you what it is, because they're in the same position as the scientists, which is to say, interacting in a world in which they are blind to the nature of the thing itself. I think that's what the scientist is doing in describing the world with mathematics. Mathematics is an epistemology without eyes. It just can't see the world. I was talking to my friend about this the other day, and he said, I guess it just doesn't really add up. And I was like, no, it does add up. It just doesn't do anything else. That's the best way that I can characterize this. So the reason why I smirked when you asked that question is because from an outside perspective, it seems like I'm coming in saying like, consciousness must be something not reducible to scientific explanation because science can't explain what things are. And then it's like, but when does anything, when can you know what anything actually is? And I go, well, consciousness. And it sounds sort of weirdly circular. But for me, it sort of went the other way around. I started with the recognition that science can't tell me what anything is. And then I'm like, but hold on, there is something I do know what it is. So if I can't describe that with scientific language, then what can I describe it with? And that's not to say that it's like that consciousness has to be some kind of mystical, spooky, supernatural thing. It's just to say that specifically the language of the scientific revolution, the language of mathematics and physics and chemistry and biology and stuff isn't going to be able to capture it. Which similarly, you wouldn't be able to capture, I don't know, the rules of chess in the language of music theory. Right? And that's not a surprise because they're doing different things, But if you decided that the entire world can be described in terms of music theory, and then you couldn't explain the rules of chess, here are your options. Either you say, well, I guess the rules of chess just can't exist. Or you say that somehow the rules of chess do exist, but they must be like reducible to music theory in some completely unimaginable and baffling manner. Or you just admit that you're wrong, that everything can be explained in terms of music theory, right? And I think that's the position we're in. People either have to say that consciousness, this doesn't exist, it's an illusion, which I think is just unthinking, literally. Or they say that consciousness is by some way reducible to physical stuff, which, never say never or anything, but I just cannot see how that could be the case. Or you just admit that you're wrong, that everything can be reducible to scientific explanation, and yet consciousness abounds.
Right, okay, yeah. So
does that make any sense?
Reductionism, illusionism, or a third way, which I suppose would either be dualism or some kind of panpsychism.
Yeah, I suppose so. Or like idealism,
Yes, yeah. But is it, when you say idealism, are you talking about like a kind of transcendental idealism whereby, our experience is framed by categories in a kind of Kantian sense? Or do you mean like a kind of, because you talked about like analytic idealism before. I just, can you help me understand that a little bit?
Kant's distinction between the phenomena and the noumena is really useful and instructive here, but I don't think we land in the same place as him. But then I don't know very much about Kant, so I say that with great care. The term analytical idealism is one that I'm sort of, I want to say I borrowed from, but it is just the worldview of Bernardo Kastrup, who's an interesting guy. I mean, he's got a lot of a fascinating attack on materialism and relatively controversial. Like when I did a show with him, half of the audience were like, this is awesome, we love Bernardo, this is so interesting. And half of them were like, who is this guy? It's like I had Deepak Chopra on or something. And it's really interesting to see. But I've got a lot of time for his views. Idealism, I guess, comes in many forms. Like idealism is broadly speaking the view that the universe is made out of mind. It's made out of like mental stuff. And there are a few ways you could cash that out, right? Like, you could be some kind of solipsist who believes that the whole universe kind of exists inside of your head. Right? That's not a view that I agree with. Certainly not that it all exists inside of your head. There's also a kind of like, so like Berkeley's most associated with idealism historically, I suppose, in the early modern period, where he just sort of started to notice that you can't really separate out your idea of a thing from the thing itself. Like you can't sort of, you can't like imagine a tree that nobody is imagining, because as soon as you're imagining it, you're imagining it. He started to realize that, you can't really see something without sort of having the experience of seeing it. And they're very connected in an important way. And basically he ends up concluding that, like stuff really only exists in so long as it's being like perceived by a mind, which I think today sounds a little bit woo-woo, and I don't really like the way that is presented. But of course, there are some obvious objections to this view, like well, if the universe needs to be like perceived in order to exist, and some people have tried to, this is the Deepak Chopra thing, trying to resurrect it by saying, well, quantum mechanics tells us that if no one's observing the moon, then the moon is just this like sort of cloud of quantum mush. It's not really how it works, but that is kind of where the Copenhagen interpretation will lead people to think. That's what Schrodinger's cat's about, by the way. Like one of my favorite misconceptions in the history of science is that Schrodinger's cat is both dead and alive. Schrodinger came up with this example in order to show how ridiculous the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics is. Like Schrodinger sort of comes along, sees this idea that like, oh, well, it's all sort of probabilistically true at once. So until I observe it, I build this system, and until I open the box, the cat is both dead and alive. Really, that's what you think. And it's just sort of embedded into pop culture as like, that's what Schrodinger really thought. It was a reductio ad absurdum. Anyway, that's a footnote. I can't remember why I brought it up either. I can't remember what I was talking about.
You're talking about...
something about, idealism. So,
yes.
So Berkeley is like, okay, so things need to be observed in order to exist. And one famous sort of counterexample to this is the melting candle, right? If I put a candle in a room and I light it on fire and I leave, when I come back in an hour's time, it will have melted. And so it seems like it must have existed even though no one was in the room to observe it. And Berkeley's response to this is that well, it was being observed by God. And that, so he sort of has, I guess your minor premise or your first premise would be like, things can only exist in so long as they're being observed. Your second premise might be something like, some things exist without being observed by any earthly creatures. Therefore, there must be some non-earthly perceiver of all things, and that's God. So there's also this view of idealism that the universe exists sort of in the mind of God. So you've got an idealism where the universe is inside of your head. There's like an idealism where the universe is kind of inside the mind of God, and we're kind of in there somewhere. Bernardo Kastrup's analytic idealism is kind of neither of these. He just thinks that the stuff the universe is made out of is mentality, is like mental states. Okay. Not the mental states of anybody, but just that the kind of things they are, or the kind of stuff that it is just mental. And it's a little bit difficult to even explain what that means. And I'm not sure I fully understand it. But I guess the mistake that might be made is I think Kastrup would say that there doesn't need to be somebody having an experience for there to be an experience, right? So in the same way that, I don't know, if there was just like a T-shirt on the floor and I was like, I think that thing is a T-shirt. And you said, oh, well, whose T-shirt is it? And I say, no, I don't think it's anybody's T-shirt. I think it's just there. And you were just like, I don't understand. How can you, like, if you have a T-shirt, it has to be somebody's T-shirt, right? Like, it has to belong to somebody. Whereas, like, no, it just doesn't. Like, most T-shirts we encounter belong to somebody, but they don't have to, right? And so Kastrup is like, yeah, like people have experiences all the time, but there doesn't need to be a person having an experience for the experience to exist. So he thinks that the world is kind of made up of whatever the sort of the substance of mind is that you have in your own mind, whatever that substance is, he just thinks the whole universe is made out of that. But that's not to say you exist in someone else's mind. It's just to say that it's made out of the same kind of stuff. Now, I think this is really interesting, but when I present these ideas, like, I don't know, Joe, you have a very serious and philosophically rigorous channel, and there'll be people thinking, what on earth is this guy banging on about? Like, I'm not an analytical idealist, right? I think it could be true, who knows? But I think it's interesting, and I'm not representing it very well here probably, but I think that these kinds of ideas about mentality being foundational rather than the physical being foundational are really sort of growing in popularity at the moment. Anybody who's paying attention, I think, in the philosophy of mind and in the sort of colloquial space, they talk about the quiet revival of Christianity at the moment. I think there's like a very quiet revival of idealism happening if you pay attention to what's going on. And so I guess I'm trying to give these views like a fair hearing. And I've got to say that there's a lot in there that I find plausible. The sort of inability for physicalists to even define what physicalism is in like a coherent manner. The inability of science to explain conscious states and the irreducibility of consciousness to like physical stuff. Those are views that I think I do agree with. So your question was, what have I changed my mind about? And I think when we first met, I don't remember where I was at. But I remember for a long time saying, I don't like calling myself a materialist because I'm so freaked out by consciousness. That's not to say I'm not a materialist, but just to say there's something weird going on there that I don't fully understand. And since I've met you, I think that has shifted from there to a sort of like, I don't think materialism is true, depending on what you mean by materialism.
Yeah, it's really interesting, actually, because I think that in some ways, a similar kind of thought has led us to quite different conclusions here. Because I have been, an argument that's been very influential on me is an argument that sort of bears a passing resemblance to Berkeley's, and it comes from Nietzsche. And it's his idea of, kind of broadly speaking, the inconceivability of the thing in itself, the thing separate from any kind of perception or perspective on that thing. And I think it's very important to note that this in itself, like people interpret Nietzsche in different ways, this in itself doesn't, much like Kastrup actually, because I don't think this is an implication of Kastrup's view either, these do not in themselves give rise to what we might call subjective idealism. So subjective idealism, to come up with a definition on the fly that I've seen used somewhere but might be like not the standard one, would be the idea that reality is up to every individual person. I think that a very interesting distinction that can sometimes bring these debates into focus a little, and also make views like analytical idealism a little bit less on their face insane seeming, is to suggest that just because something is mind framed or made of mental stuff, because that's going beyond mind framed. Mind framed would be something like saying that, an argument that I've made in the past, which is that in favor of like some loose form of pragmatism, funnily enough, which is that all of the incoming stuff is in some sense shaped by both our perceptual apparatus in a kind of human-wide sense, in a kind of naturalized Kant sense, but also shaped by our own conceptual scheme. Like, as in, it's only a good example of this. Like, if you see a shape off in the distance that is, in fact, a tree, but looks a bit like a man, your brain will sometimes complete that, and you will just perceive it as a man. Like, it's not that there's sense data coming in, and then the interpretation is, like, laid on top of that. There's a certain type of interpretation baked into every experience. And, I've used that in various different ways in the past, but one way that you might take this thought experiment is to say that, look, just because I can see this guy as a tree or a man, or I can see this tree as a tree or a man, doesn't mean that I can see him as an elephant. Like, just because we're admitting that there might be some kind of mental interference in perceptions, that doesn't in any way apply a kind of subjectivism about truth, or like an extreme subjectivism about truth. I suppose to a certain extent it implies that our definitions of truth must be what's called cognitive interest relevant. Cognitive interest relative, which just means that they're the kind of things that are shaped by us being humans, which I don't think is nearly as controversial. And this distinction is from Hasok Chang. And you contrast this with mind controlled, which is when you actually do control things. So, like, you might think that if I imagine a really embarrassing memory from my past, I can make myself feel embarrassed. I might even be able to make myself blush. That's a mind-controlled state. It's also a mind-frame state, but it's a mind-controlled state. And just because something is mind-framed doesn't mean that it's mind-controlled. And I suppose in theory, just because something's mind-controlled doesn't mean it's mind-framed, but I just can't think of a good example of the other way. But I think that, like, the blurry shape off in the distance that could materialize in a whole bunch of different ways, but clearly can't materialize in every way or any way, I think is a good example of how, just because somebody says something like the world might be made up of ideas, or you can't have access to the thing in itself, you can have access to different perspectives, and those perspectives might diverge, doesn't mean that the divergence is like infinite or unbounded. You can have very definite limits on what it's possible to perceive, while still incorporating a human element into perception. So it seems like we basically want to balance two things. We want to have the external world as like stable enough to do all of the things that we can or to account for all the things that we clearly do with the world. Like, if you and I go to the same room and look at the same thing, we're going to have a similar enough experience that we can then communicate information between us about it and build entire models of reality that we seem to be able to use to interfere with reality in pretty incredible ways. At the same time, we want to recognize that we're not, like, spiritually totally distinct from the world, unless you're like a dualist, right? I think that, for all his reputation as a skeptic, one of the lovely things of Descartes' philosophy is it sort of allows you to have like pretty direct knowledge of the world, not in a direct realist sense, but like pretty uninterfered with knowledge of the world. If we're part of the world, we just don't have that. We have to account for the fact that all of our perceptions and judgments are human perceptions and judgments. I think that, if you're going to be a consistent naturalist, that needs to be something that you take into account. That actually, there are certain things, there's a certain kind of doublespeak we sometimes do, I think, in philosophy, where we accept that we're part of the natural world without fully treating ourselves as part of the natural world. And I think that is...
Yes.
That's a tension that I think, well, hopefully, the next 50 years of philosophy, I think, is very well placed to dig into. But sorry, that was a bit of a standard rant.
One hopes.
So, just to bring that. Sorry, you were going to say something.
No, it's good. It's your show. I've been speaking way too much, but it's nice to be under the assumption when you're the one being interviewed. It's nice to feel the freedom to keep talking, because I like to do that on my own show a lot of the time. But then I feel bad for the guest that's got on the train and come down. But what you say about us, sort of in some way constructing the world, in that. Like the thing that you see is going to be dependent on what your brain is doing to interpret the data that's coming in. But that's not to say that it can do anything. I think is totally right. So like to say that the world is made out of mental states or something, or that panpsychism is true, that consciousness is foundational, is not to say that your sort of interior mental world is completely like disconnected from the real world outside. It's just to say that the real world outside is of a different kind of thing to the way that you are like interpreting it as physical matter. So our brains are interpreting the world around us as physical. We see extension, we see weight, we see color, and we see all that kind of stuff. But like, actually, Kastrup helpfully compares us to like to aeroplanes. Most people know, even when I say this in other contexts where it doesn't feel like I'm about to pull the wool over people's eyes, I'm just like, you understand that like, you don't have direct access to the world. Like, we like to think that we're just sort of sat inside of our heads, and then we've got these great big windows that we're sort of looking at the world through. But it's quite clear that what's really happening is the world as it is this sort of jumbled mess of like waves and particles and energy and all kinds of stuff that's like photons are being fired at these receptors. And people always talk about how like, well, then, our brains sort of translate that information into the experience of sight. And everybody knows that this is what's going on. Again, this is the noumena versus the phenomena. Kant was right in saying that we will never know the thing in itself. We will only know it as we perceive it. So then the question is, do we think there's any good reason that our evolutionary heritage would have for giving us essentially an inaccurate picture of the world? Well, yes, like loads of reasons to suggest that, like if you just experienced the world directly as it is, it would just be this like overload of information and you wouldn't know what to do with any of it. You need to sort of categorize it. You need to categorize it into useful things. I think the reason that we perceive objects is because they're functional. I'm a mereological nihilist. I don't believe in a distinction between material objects, but I think we perceive these distinctions because, you want a cup so you can grab it and drink out of. You want a tool so you can use it to do stuff. But also, like, everybody knows that evolution selects for survivability rather than truth. So the way that our faculties have evolved to interpret the world is based on what's most useful to us, rather than like trying to be sensitive to the true nature of the world. So our brains produce this sort of dashboard of sensory data that we, wherever we are, inside of our skulls, are sort of sat by. It's like that film. I didn't see it, but the it's called like Inside Out or something, where there's all the little creatures inside of the brain.
Yeah, the little homunculi.
And they're all sort of controlled. So something a bit like that. That's kind of how we like to picture ourselves. But you can compare that to us being like inside of the cockpit of an airplane. And an airplane is traveling through the sky, and there's like a real world out there, right? But you're a pilot, and suppose the windows are closed or it's too dark to see, you're flying at night, whatever. And so what you have is this dashboard of information in front of you that tells you about your velocity, the air pressure outside, it tells you your altitude, it tells you all kinds of stuff, right? It even tells you like, is someone using the toilet or whatever. Now, like, we understand that when somebody manufactured this cockpit, they realized that there's this real world out there which we want to and there are sensors on the outside of the airplane which then translate that data into a way that makes sense for us to use. So we've got a bunch of numbers on a screen, right? We've got, a graph that tells us where we are in the sky and stuff. It would be a massive mistake to say, sat inside of that cockpit, you know, I think that outside of this airplane, what is actually outside of this airplane right now is like a graph or is, you know, a series of numbers. I think that is like what is outside of the plane. You'd sound like you'd completely lost your mind because, yeah, I understand that that is what you are observing on this dashboard, which is representing the data that's hitting the sensors outside on the airplane, but it's not presenting it to you as it really is. It's presenting it to you in a way that you'll be able to interpret and understand it. But our sensors, our sensory data is doing the same kind of thing. It's taking the world as it is, and it's translating it in a way into a way that we can sort of functionally understand. And so we have to realize that the very way that we are perceiving the world is very, like, I'm not saying that this proves this is the case, but there's a sort of very strong likelihood, I would say, that we're not experiencing the world as the world actually is, in the same way that the dashboard of our perception is not accurately representing the world, in the way that the dashboard of the airplane is not accurately representing the clouds outside. But that's not to say that the dashboard on the airplane can just say whatever it likes. It is still sensitive and exactly correlated to a real world out there. You know, it can't suddenly tell you that you're on the ground when you're actually, you know, 5,000 feet in the air.
Yes,
and yet it's not giving you a true representation of the world out there. So similarly, you might not be getting a real representation of what the world is actually like, but it is going to be like dependent on the real world. It's going to be causally connected to the outside world. It's going to correlate exactly with the outside world. So there's accuracy in that sense. But the mistake that we're making is like a metaphysical one. Like, because I experience a world of objects and physicality and kilograms and centimeters, that must be what the world is really made of. That's the mistake that someone like Kastrup thinks that people are making. And again, I want to issue another throat clearing that these are just views that I think are interested and am excited by. I have no idea whether it's true, but I think that they are entering the discussion in a big way. And I think if you are sat there thinking this is all nonsense and it sounds kind of insane, then fair enough. But then we need a few more people telling us why that's the case.
I think that because I think it's a thought that that a lot of people have, especially if, you know, encountering Kant and having this noumenal phenomenal distinction put to you, you get this kind of idea of what we're seeing is not going to be what's out there in some kind of heavyweight sense. I think that's one possible or one interesting inference, let's say, because, you know, people might not consider this a problem at all, of that idea where you have kind of an outer world that is true in some kind of conceivable sense, and this, you know, perceptually filtered world that is kind of not true, but it's like a kind of necessary illusion, sometimes known as the kind of falsification thesis, is that under this viewpoint, you can picture a theory, and we'll call it T, because that's what philosophers do when they come up with theories. They call them T. And this theory has everything you can possibly want from a theory. It accounts for every observation and will account for every observation. And it's also, you know, wonderfully elegant and simple and usable. There is no way in which we can improve this theory, and it accounts for everything. According to the kind of this falsification thesis, that theory could, and indeed is, still false. And then, you know, one potential challenge you could raise when you've made that inference is to say something like, well, like, if that theory could be and is false, then, like, how did we come up with this concept of truth that seems to be to do with correspondence to something that we, like, literally can never, have never, and will never access? Because that's my thinking on this kind of thing, is that there's a sense in which that thought is clearly onto something, right? The idea that there clearly is, like, there is a thing, or maybe not, I don't necessarily want to call it a thing. There are limits to our perceptions that clearly aren't up to us. And to that extent, it seems like inferring this kind of extra plane that is limiting all of our perceptual stuff seems to make a lot of sense, right? Nonetheless, it also seems to be inconceivable, like in a very heavyweight sense. Like, I can't conceive of what that could be or is. And also, it seems like my whole concept of truth can't, unless I posit that I have some kind of direct noumenal access to this, can't have anything to do with that at all. You know, our concepts of truth are clearly crafted within this kind of communal perceptual patchwork, let's call it. And so that's kind of what I am saying is I either end up saying something like, okay, yeah, maybe they don't correspond to this like thing in itself, but like I don't see how that necessarily matters all that much, because it seems like the thing in itself, since we can't ever get at it, I don't see like what work it's doing. Clearly, our kind of everyday talk and even our philosophically heavyweight talk of truth has to be not hooking onto this noumenal world. And also, a slightly more extreme point of that, saying something like, well, it seems like the noumenal world just is inconceivable. Like I can't, like the more I look at the concept, the less it seems like I can create like a consistent characterization of it, or even a coherent characterization of it. I don't know. I find that kind of thing very interesting. And I think that's probably what's pushed me towards pragmatism over the years.
Yeah, but the thing is, if you want to say, actually, no, the way that I experience the world is just how it is, right? Like I just have direct, unmediated access to the world as it really is. Then I think you have to get a little bit meditative and think, well, how, like being precise here, like how do you actually experience the world? Like you experience it as a collection of experiences, right? Like there's a microphone in front of me, and okay, I think it's there, but what am I talking about when I say that it's there? Well, I can see it, and everybody knows that visual experience is a kind of experience. Okay, but I can also touch it. Yeah, but that's also an experience. I'm feeling the resistance of the electrons or whatever, and maybe I can hear it when I tap on it, but that's an experience too. And so even if you want to say, like, no, I just will not abandon the idea that I just am experiencing the world as it really is, then given that everything comes to you as an experience, that's how the world presents itself to you, then there is some grounds for saying that if you are experiencing the world as it really is, then the universe is just made of experiences, because that's all you ever experience, right? That you can't experience something that is not an experience. You cannot experience a non-experience. And so I don't know, like I think it's a bit weird, man. It's a bit weird because we have this view that everything is sort of that everything is separable from our experience, that there's sort of us and our experience and our sort of internal sort of awareness, and then there's this world out there. And that might be true, but the idea that in practice we can actually know what that difference is or have anything to say about it, as you say, I think is impossible. But I mean, you talked about truth. How can we talk about truth if the noumenal world is like unreachable, and yet truth seems to be correspondence with facts about the noumenal world? Well, maybe it's just time to abandon your theory of truth, Joe. I mean, I don't know what your theory of truth is.
That's exactly what I think I think the correspondence theory of truth in this, in any sense that's beyond the kind of trivial equivalence thesis version, where like you say that, P is true if and only if P, which is like deeply uninformative, but like it is like a truism about truth that you can give. I just think the metaphysically heavyweight correspondence theory of truth just kind of is a bit of a dead end.
I really like that idea that, P is true if and only if P, because I mean, I think, I don't know a lot about like the philosophy of truth, as it were, but I think I'm a deflationist about truth. And this might just come from my heritage as an emotivist, where in ethics, to say something is true is just to express it. It doesn't actually add any sort of really cognitive like content. I sort of wonder if the same thing is true writ large. So deflationists about truth are people who think that the qualifier is true just doesn't add anything. Like there's no difference between me saying the sky is blue and me saying it is true that the sky is blue. In both cases, I'm just like asserting something. And so to say it is true is just to assert the thing. Obviously, there are all kinds of complications with that. I spoke to Simon Blackburn on my show, link in the description, about deflationary theories of truth, and I think they've got a lot going for them. It seems a little bit unsatisfying, but yeah, you could say like, P is true if and only if P, because P is just an expression. So P is true if and only if P. Like in both of those instances, you are just asserting something, and they're just doing the same thing.
Well, I'm pretty open to deflationist theories of truth. I think the deflationist theories of truth sort of kick the can for explanation down to like what is an assertion and what is a belief. So like, I think that, because I think you can give a pretty good functional analysis of what somebody does when they say something is true. Or like, let's not get hung up on is true. Let's just say when somebody asserts something as a truth claim. There's a brilliant paper on this by Hugh Price called Truth is a Convenient Friction. And the idea there is that he wants to argue and does so, I think pretty persuasively, that at least one of the things that truth does in practice is signal an intolerance for disagreement about something, and also lets everyone else know that they can impose a kind of cost on you for getting this wrong. So, like, because that then serves a very useful social purpose, because we've got to coordinate behavior. And part of coordinating behavior is knowing like stable experiences, let's say, to not commit us to any kind of truth claim. You've got to know that if someone says the log is there, they're telling you that if you go into that clearing, you're going to see a log, and you're going to be able to do all of the log-like things you want to do with a log. All of the normal log rules apply, not logarithmic
things
rules.
Are. I like that a lot as a view.
And I think that is kind of, and you can give this as an account of truth. You can also just give it as an account of assertion. So like another interesting account of truth I think comes from C.S. Peirce, or Peirce, as some apparently it's like sometimes I've heard people pronounce it Peirce, I've heard people pronounce it Peirce, and I just say
I've never heard of this person in my entire life. I can guarantee it probably doesn't matter too much.
He's absolutely brilliant. He's like he made a very, very early system of logic that was all to do with boxes, and it was fantastic. And
cool.
And among other things, he was a very, very early pragmatist thinker. And his definition of truth is what will hold at the ideal end of inquiry, which is, one way of saying that truth is the perfect theory. So something that will account for everything and will always account for everything, which of course is a regulative ideal.
Truth is God.
Yeah, like we'll never reach this, or we might reach it, but I'm pretty skeptical. But that was kind of his idea of fleshing out truth. And I think these kind of these sorts of, I want to say anthropocentric, and I don't really mean that as a criticism. I mean that like we're trying to account for how humans use a word and use a concept that seems to be useful enough that it crops up everywhere. Like, truth isn't just one of those words that only appears in English, and it's certainly not one of the concepts that only appears in English. It's all over the shop. So like, why is it that we converge on this? And I think that these more pragmatic theories do give us somewhere to go there. I find them very, very, very appealing. And it's interesting how, to a certain extent, the same kinds of thoughts that have pushed you to be more sympathetic, at least, to idealism, have pushed me to be more sympathetic to pragmatism. In that I think they both stem from a sort of, I don't know, like recentering of the fact that we are humans experiencing the world at kind of the starting point of philosophy.
Yeah, I'm just a girl in the world, as it were. I actually think, like, you're right, but I should clarify that this is kind of how our conversation has gone today, but my starting point isn't really the disconnect between the noumena and the phenomena, right? Like, that's a starting point for talking about what we're talking about. But for me, really the starting point for all of this was the disconnect between what materialists describe as like physical objects and the sort of experiential quality and nature of consciousness. Now, I'm obviously not the first person to come across this problem, right? Like, it's, I would say, possibly the foundational sort of question of philosophy. People, it's sort of, I say it's like tied with, where did everything come from for like foundational questions. And some would say maybe that the answer is the same for both, but like, I think that realizing that whatever consciousness is, it cannot be reduced to what people describe as physical stuff, inert atoms, electrons orbiting protons and neutrons, is kind of my starting point. Because then it's like, okay, so then how do we make sense of the fact that consciousness does exist? I know that consciousness exists. In fact, I'm more confident consciousness exists than I am that the material world exists, because I could be having an illusion of the world around me. I could be a brain in a vat, but I can't be deceived that I'm having some kind of experience, right? So, I sort of start there. Start, in a similar way to Descartes, which is to say that I think, therefore I am, But I wouldn't even go that far because, a lot of people have criticized Descartes, particularly from like an Eastern perspective, that Descartes is kind of just assuming the self. Like the idea of the self is so deeply embedded into our psychology that even when trying to doubt everything that can be doubted, Descartes fails because he says, I think, therefore I am, rather than I think, therefore thinking is happening. I think, therefore consciousness exists. It's I think, therefore I am, which is actually like a massive leap. It's actually like a pretty big leap. I mean, he does have I think on like one side of this. So I think, therefore I am. But it's probably more accurate to say something like, thoughts are happening, therefore thoughts exist. You know what I mean?
Yes, yeah. It's
Something
like
that.
Because initially, was it? It's like that doubt exists is indubitable. Is like seemingly the point that he starts with. And then, I know you know much more about Descartes than I do. In fact, you changed my mind on Descartes because I used to interpret the cogito as an argument, and now I interpret it as an intuition, and that came from a conversation we had.
Descartes goes back and forth on this, like he in his own sort of what's the word, correspondence with people. I mean, he replies to objections. If you read a copy of the Meditations, he wrote to lots of sort of contemporary philosophers, and he also has like private letters and things. And in fairness, like we talked about this once, where like we often assume that philosophers just kind of exist in a vacuum, that they sort of pop out of the womb, ideas fully formed, and don't change their mind until they die. Like people are always going back and forth. If Descartes lived in the world of podcasts, I'm pretty sure that if you interviewed him at 35 and interviewed him at 60, I don't even know how long he lived, whatever, he would change his mind about various things. And particularly on like the specifics, he might go, yeah, well, I kind of used to cash it out this way, but now I cash it out that way. So on some occasions, it seems like mostly Descartes treats the cogito as a singular intuition of the mind. But there are occasions in which he does seem to kind of also want to treat it like a syllogism. But it's not. I mean, I don't think it's supposed to be. In fact, if you read the Meditations, the phrase "I think, therefore I am" doesn't actually show up. I think that comes from the discourse on the method or something. So it first shows up in French before the famous Latin translation. It first shows up as "Je pense donc je suis," and then it's cogito ergo sum. And it seems to be, for those who are listening who don't know, like it's not supposed to be premise one, I think, therefore conclusion, I am. It's supposed to kind of all happen at once, It's just this one singular intuition of the mind. But I have that in common with the Descartes. I know that experience is happening, right? And then I started to realize that what I call my individualized self is a bit of a dubious concept. And for that, I'm deeply indebted to Ian McGilchrist, one of my favorite thinkers on the planet, who has done a lot of work on split brain patients. And I'm working my way through the matter with things. Like he's also, I think he's like a genius. But he thinks that the hemispheric divide between the two sort of hemispheres of the brain is like the key to kind of understanding everything. Like that is the sort of foundational starting point for so many people. And most importantly, there's good evidence to suggest that at least in the case of split brain patients, where they've had the corpus callosum that connects the two hemispheres severed, and so their brains aren't communicating properly, the two hemispheres, that they seem to have different sort of centers of awareness. You can show an image to one side of the brain that the other side of the brain doesn't see. So you can watch this on YouTube. It's fascinating. You can watch experiments of split brain patients being fed a word to their right visual field, which goes to their left hemisphere, and they'll tell you what the word is. They'll say, oh, it says bird, it says hat, it says cloak. And then if you show a word to their left visual field, which goes to their right hemisphere, they'll say, I didn't see anything. I don't know what you're talking about. But then if you give them a pen in their left hand and ask them to draw something, they will draw the word that they saw. So they will literally like draw a thing which they just told you and will still then tell you they didn't see. Because the right hemisphere controls the left-hand side of the body, and the left hemisphere, which also controls speech. So if you only show it to the right hemisphere, the left arm can draw the picture, but the left hemisphere which speaks won't be able to tell you. It's an oversimplification. It's not that like left hemisphere does speech and language. It doesn't really work like that, but it's a sort of helpful way of putting it. But there are all kinds of interesting experiments. Like, for example, in these split brain patients, they can more easily, like if I showed you two shapes and asked you to draw both each with one hand, you'd really struggle to coordinate. Split brain patients can do it, no problem.
Oh, wow.
Also, if you show them two words like the word scraper on one side and the word sky on the other, you know, they will be able to draw. They'll draw a picture of the sky, and they'll draw like a scraper, like an object, and they'll draw them both, but they will draw them separately. Whereas you and I might draw a skyscraper, they'll put it together. Like, it's so interesting how they will literally, like, they've obviously seen both, and that the hand that's doing the drawing has seen both of these words, but it doesn't connect them. It doesn't put them together. So they're both there, but they're not integrated. They're not connected. And I'm thinking, look, if inside your brain right now, there is one hemisphere which can be aware of stuff that the other hemisphere is not, what does that mean for our sort of assumption that awareness is something which is emergent of the brain and is like this singular unified thing? I think that just can't be true. Now, I'm not going to say that this completely eliminates the self. I'm pretty suspicious of the concept of the self. This doesn't get you there on its own, but it at the very least starts to shatter this picture. And so that is more like my starting point. And so when someone like Descartes says, I think, therefore I am, if one of his hemispheres is thinking something that he, like his speaking or rational brain or whatever, like isn't aware of, it seems fair to say that like thinking is happening. But to say that therefore I am would be a miscalculation. And so, yeah, I think Descartes' doubt doesn't quite go far enough.
I mean, I agree with the skepticism about the self, even just introspectively. I think that if you are to, I mean, this is a kind of Humean thought experiment, I suppose, but I think its most sophisticated form actually does also come from Nietzsche. Is this idea that, you know, if you burrow inside yourself introspectively, you don't find a single thing. You find something like a sort of writhing collection of drives and affects and desires and kind of ideas that emerge. But like, they don't, like, you don't come up with the idea. The idea kind of pops up to you. I don't know if has anyone ever, tried to observe yourself coming up with a thought. It just kind of appears.
It's not that there's you and then there's a bunch of perceptions that happen to you. It's that there's a bunch of perceptions and then there's a you that comes out of that, you know? You are an emergent concept.
I mean, out of interest, did this kind of thinking cause you to turn more towards panpsychism than dualism there?
Yeah, always. Because I mean, like, dualism I've always seen as a kind of, as firstly, just extremely like non-parsimonious. Like I just have a really strong intuition that monism is true. Like it seems very philosophically expensive to introduce a whole extra like kind of substance, and it's difficult to even. It took me a long time to really understand what it would mean to say that there are two kinds of substances, because you're kind of imagining like, oh, Coca-Cola and Sprite, or you're imagining, like a red thing and a blue thing, like two different substances is like two different just like modes of being, two different like kinds of existence, and that they somehow interact. I mean, of course, the biggest problem for dualism is the interaction problem. And I don't know, it just seems much simpler to me to suggest that actually this great mystery of how we get conscious experience out of material stuff can be solved by some kind of way that attempts to unify them. Most people agree with that. Like, even materialists will say, yeah, no, I'm not a dualist. I think that consciousness and material are the same thing. And, so does the idealist, so does the panpsychist. They just kind of go the other way. I've never seen a good reason to posit that dualism is true, except for the difficulty with accepting that the material world exists and accepting that there's consciousness and accepting that they can't sort of emerge from each other. But to say that therefore there must just be two types of stuff, I think is a mistake,
And also, I think there are. It's interesting because I, talking to you a fair amount about panpsychism over the past couple of years, I think that one of the observations I made about panpsychism is that occasionally it gets very close to being a form of physicalism, right?
Yeah.
Because occasionally you'll hear panpsychism be put forward as in an attempt to dispel the kind of rocks can think perception of panpsychism. You'll occasionally see panpsychists say something like, well, no, like subatomic particles don't have mental states in the same way that we do. They just have the kind of stuff that can give rise to mental states. And I do occasionally think that's almost what a physicalist would say. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Because if you're like physicalist leaning, then that's a really good thing. You can say actually panpsychism is a reasonably conservative position. If you're a panpsychist because of the kind of troublesomeness of mutual irreducibility, if you think that holds, then this potentially might not be such a great thing. There's a danger that we're smuggling in reducibility through the back door by just relabeling the idea that consciousness can emerge from non-significantly conscious stuff. How do you deal with that difficulty when you're exploring panpsychism?
Well, I think you're right. Like, I think that there are different kind of types of panpsychism. Some people think that atoms are conscious. Some people think, they call it like proto-panpsychism or something like that, the view that they kind of have stuff which, when put together in the right way, gives rise to consciousness. But then you're kind of, as you say, I think you're just back to physicalism. I think, in a way, you could think of panpsychism not as an attempt to like debunk physicalism, but an attempt to like fill in an important gap in physicalism, which is the isness. So you could say, the panpsychist agrees with the materialist that the universe is kind of made out of small, indivisible little bits, little like particles, and that's the way to think about what the universe is made out of. Yeah, so if you're not careful as a panpsychist, you do kind of just begin to describe physicalism in other terms, right? I think that any words like proto-panpsychism, this sort of idea that like, particles aren't exactly conscious, but they're made up of the stuff that, when put together in the right way, gives you consciousness, you're kind of back to the same problem as the physicalist. I think that your best bet as a panpsychist is to say, no, the universe is made out of fundamental units of consciousness. It's like there from the start. But in a way, I kind of want to say that the panpsychist doesn't need to debunk physicalism. They can kind of see themselves as filling in a gap with physicalism, which is to say, the physicalist is like, I don't know what an atom is. I know what it does, but I don't know what it's actually made out of. And the panpsychist says, well, I feel like we all know what consciousness is, and we all experience it, and that science hasn't yet accounted for it. And you've got this gap at the bottom of science, and you've got this gap of like what something actually is. Like, let's just fill in that gap. And not in a like panpsychism of the gaps kind of way, not in like we don't know what it is, therefore panpsychism, but like we know what consciousness is. We know that it's in the world, and we know that it must therefore kind of come from somewhere. And the physicalist is like, I've got absolutely no place for consciousness in my entire system, but at the very bottom, I've got this massive gap that just so happens to be a gap of what something is, which is the very thing you say consciousness sort of has, like isness, direct experience. We know what it is. And it just seems like maybe a bit of an odd coincidence that those two things seem to line up so much. So the panpsychist could kind of just be saying, yeah, okay, physicalism is true, but when we're talking about what atoms are actually made out of, in the same way the scientist says, well, we just have a fundamental unit of mass, fundamental unit of charge, you feel like we've got a fundamental unit of consciousness or a fundamental unit of will or something like that. And suddenly it's not like the most radical view in the entire world. It still sounds a little bit weird because you're ascribing like conscious or mental states to subatomic particles. But just listen to any quantum physicist talk about the nature of particles and tell me that doesn't sound insane too. I mean, it'll be like, you'll go to a conference and there'll be like a bunch of speakers and one of them will say, I think we need to introduce 38 new dimensions to fully understand the nature of string theory. And everyone goes, that's interesting. And then someone goes, Yeah, like I think that, particles are sort of everywhere at once until someone observes them and then they like collapse into it and everyone goes, that's really interesting. Someone says, I think there are almost infinitely many like versions of reality which are created at every sort of quantum, and everyone's like, that's great. Someone comes along and says, I think that the qualitative mental experience that we all know exists is present at the subatomic level, and everyone goes, this guy has lost his mind, get him out of the conference. And I just think it's a little bit unfair.
And I think that one of the things that has historically, I suppose, been inferred from the idea that consciousness exists and sort of permeates matter or permeates the world, is I think how it's been put in ages past, is to then infer from that the world itself is, minded, has a kind of center of awareness, I suppose, in the same way that a human does, but just at a much larger scale, and that we are contained within this wider mind. That, I think, is one of the, not necessarily inferences from panpsychism, because panpsychists can just deny that the universe itself combines in the right way to give rise to a mind. Though, of course, in order to do that, the combination problem would need to be solved, and I suppose that's its own can of worms. But I think that might potentially be one thing that tends to put people off panpsychism. Not necessarily the idea that at some level there's the grounding for consciousness in particles in some philosophical sense, but that the implications of this might lead us to think that the world itself is one big mind. I mean, how do you grapple with that?
Well, as you say, panpsychism has a problem called the combination problem, which is that if the universe is made out of like tiny little atoms of consciousness, why is it that when you put them together in the right way, they seem to combine into singular brains? So like I've got a mind, you've got a mind, and it's this sort of unified conscious experience. How does that make any sense if like sort of you've got all these little individual atoms? And there are a few ways to approach this. I mean, one is that you could just say, firstly, you could say that actually minds don't combine. Like we were just talking about this illusion of the self, the idea that actually you've just got a bunch of perceptions that are kind of, if you're a sort of sturdy enough meditator, you might begin to sort of notice that you are just this disparate sort of collection of perceptions, in which case there kind of is no combination problem. It's just like a bunch of experiences all kind of happening in the same place, in the same physical place. And that's what you kind of are. Very difficult to shake that though, because like there is like a sense in which I am having those experiences. I believe in myself. But if you took that view, then you could say, well, like there is only the sort of foundational consciousness permeating the universe and nothing ever truly gets combined. So in a way, there is like a God, a big sort of universe mind, but only in the way that you or I have minds. It kind of feels like that, but it's not some special new thing that exists. It's just the collection of these conscious experiences all sort of put together. That's just what that mind is. And so, yeah, there would be something it is like to be the universe in the same way there's something it's like to be me and like to be you. But on like a metaphysical level, that's kind of a bit of an illusion for whoever's having it.
I suppose one reason why we might want to ask like important questions about when things combine into certain types of mental states is that mental states often give rise to, well, I don't know, we could call it moral relevance, or we could just call it the kind of things that we tend to care about. Like pain is a thing that we tend to care about. It would matter to most people if I told them that, every time you put your laptop on your desk, the desk feels that. And to know that the desk doesn't feel anything in the sense of, having mental states that are complex enough, like pain and pleasure, to be worthy of consideration or to give rise to empathy. I think that would be a relevant thing that people want to know. And also I think that the cost of saying that ordinary objects, there's something that it's like to be what we would normally call inanimate objects, and taking that route to solving the combination problem does then seem to give rise to these like quite interesting and potentially soluble, but troubling philosophical implications about.
Yeah, so I don't think we should take that route. I mean, I think that's one thing you could say, or an idea that you can explore, but it doesn't seem like a very satisfying route to me. I think it's just worth a mention. I mean, another is to say that there is just some principle by which things combine and produce unified experiences and others don't. A bit like how, chemicals bond with each other, and there's a reason why like some chemicals form bonds and some of them bounce off each other. And there's just like a reason why that happens, and some of them do and some of them don't, right? And maybe there's just some rule a bit like that. But I mean, the thing is, panpsychism just clings on to this like atomistic view of the universe. It's actually it's a very left brain way of thinking. It's sort of looking at the small particulars and trying to build up a big picture from it. Whereas I think the idealist does the opposite. They've got like a big one big mind consciousness thing, out of which you localize and create sort of individual consciousnesses. So like the panpsychists, you could imagine them like pointillist painters, with the canvas, like putting little dots all over the canvas and trying to build up this beautiful picture. And you will sort of get a big picture if you step back and look at it. You'll see the picture, but it's going to be gappy, And that's not how we experience the world. We experience it smoothly. Whereas if you just have one great big perfectly smooth canvas of beautiful red, and then you sort of take some scissors and cut out a little bit of it, then the thing you've cut out is going to be perfectly smooth. And maybe it's better to think of our experience like that. Now, when we talk about like religious ideas, because we're talking about God and pantheism, I think that you don't need to do very much work to get a view like that, like this idealism, to be in keeping with a great deal of what our religious traditions have told us. Panpsychism is probably a result of modernity. It's probably a result of wanting to atomize the world. I mean, yeah, there are atomists like Democritus in the ancient world, but you know what I mean? Like, it's this attempt to keep hold of a divisible world where the ontologically primary thing is what you end up with when you divide it. So it's like, I don't know, like, you either account for the crumbs in terms of the cake or the cake in terms of the crumbs. You get what I'm saying?
Yes, yeah.
And I feel like the panpsychist is trying to account for the cake in terms of the crumbs, whereas the idealist starts with the cake and then accounts for the crumbs. So, like in Christianity, you have ideas about God, in whom we sort of move and have our being. In some sense, our like being is dependent upon and yet also in God's being. Yeah, like if God is one great big mind, there's a thread to follow there. But of course, the Indian tradition is most closely associated with views like these. And yeah, I mean, typically, depending on the tradition, you'll kind of have this view that there's one great big self that we're all kind of like participating in, or we're all like manifesting. And this is not like panpsychism. This is more like idealism. It's not like there's loads of tiny individual cells, like trillions and trillions of cells across the universe. There's just one. There's one of them. And by some kind of mystery that we don't fully understand, we're kind of participating in that. And it's a bit weird. It's like, how did they work that out? I think it's got a lot to do with psychedelics. I think that the ninth mandala of the Rig Veda is dedicated to a psychedelic substance called soma, and that like if you take psychedelics, one of the things that they do is they produce an ego death, and they produce a recognition that you literally begin to feel like you are one with the universe. Not to say that I know what you're thinking and I know what's happening in Wisconsin right now, but that in some inexplicable way, I realize that I am kind of just like one kind of part of this great big whole, and we're all just kind of the same kind of thing. It's like Rumi says, you're not the drop in the ocean, you're the ocean inside of the drop. All of that kind of language and poetry and religious mysticism, I think, points towards this idea. Which, if you're trying to align this sort of ancient religious wisdom with the philosophical ideas that we're talking about today, I think idealism gives you the best like synthesis. Interestingly, like we talked about dualism earlier, right? And the Sankhya school of Indian philosophy is a dualistic ancient school of Indian philosophy. But interestingly, it's not the same kind of dualism as we have in the Western tradition. In the West, the dualism is between mind and body. Whereas the Sankhya school kind of asks, I mean, yeah, you've got a body, but you've also got mental stuff. I feel pain and I feel pleasure and I feel anxiety. But there's a sense in which like someone's having those experiences. right? There's like, it's not just that there is this pain floating out there in the ether. It's like the pain is happening to someone. And yet all of that is mental, right? All of that is in the conscious experience. There's no physicality about this. Like, or if I just have a thought, if I just think about what time it is or think about a memory or something, there seems to be this separation between like me and the thought that I'm having. And so the Sankhya school, to put it kind of crudely, doesn't have a dualism of mind and body. They have a dualism of like mind and body over here, and then like the self.
Mm.
And it's like that's the sort of dual reality. Is you've got this personhood, this experiencer, and that is one thing, and all of the stuff that happens to the experiencer, whether it be mental or physical, is the other kind of stuff. And so it's kind of it's like a different kind of dualism that comes out. And there are parts of the Bhagavad Gita which are quite explicitly dualistic in this way. If you read the Upanishads, they're a lot more like monist, and more in line with the like Advaita Vedanta tradition of there being kind of that the self and reality are all just like one big thing. But there's a lot there, man. Like there's a lot to explore. And I really think that the psychedelic experience has a lot to do with this, in that some of the things which philosophers struggle over long periods of time to land on, like this idea that, wait, hold on, like, consciousness, I don't really understand, like maybe there's only one kind of stuff, maybe the universe is made out of mentality, and it's all a bit confusing. And then people take a psychedelic drug and they just sort of instantly intuit the kind of answers to these questions that are very difficult to rationally sort of get at. And so I think if some of the Indian philosophical tradition that I'm talking about has its roots in psychedelic experiences, I don't know, that just begins to make a lot of sense to me as to why they would have hit on these ideas that early on, and that once psychedelics sort of stopped being a part of the rituals that they were participating in, it all became a bit sort of abstract and ritualistic,
Right. I mean, the interesting point there, I think, partly is that there's a tension between, in a lot of theistic traditions, but also just it's in modern apologetics, but it's just bubbling away in the background, between kind of theistic immanence and theistic transcendence. So,
yeah. I
mean, one way that you've attempted to communicate a kind of immanent God beforehand is to say something like, is it Yellowstone Park, where the whole thing is the volcano?
Yeah.
That as a metaphor. Yeah. And I think that the interesting thing about following that through is you end up in some kind of pantheism. Following that metaphor through, you end up in some kind of immanent pantheism. Maybe along the lines of Spinoza, but I don't understand Spinoza enough to really say that. So, we'll say that it's pseudo-Spinozist.
Yeah.
This kind of picture of the universe where God is entirely immanent. I find that really interesting, partly because I think that it's interesting to explore what an immanent God can do versus what a transcendent God can do versus what one with one foot in either camp can do. Because I think that in some ways the idea of a kind of vaguely pantheist immanent God is probably significantly more palatable to a lot of people who are currently agnostics or atheists. At the same time, with pure immanence, you get rid of a whole lot of other things. You get rid of the idea of a kind of non-physical afterlife, for example. You can't really have that unless you've got something also transcendent as well as immanent. I think that a lot of the kind of tensions and to a certain extent, I think a fair amount of the confusions within sometimes where you'll see agnostics and atheists have a kind of dispute over this is because sometimes the theist is trying to put forward a kind of immanent God with some kind of transcendent parts to it. And that actually, exploring which bits of the God being put forward is immanent and which bits are transcendent could hopefully clear up some of this confusion. I mean, there are lots of confusions within sort of atheist and theist debates, and you've done an awful lot of them. What are the main confusions that seem to kind of pervade the atmosphere when it comes to kind of our atheist, agnostic, theistic discussions?
I think that a great deal of thinking about God relies on unhelpful concepts and is impoverished by a sort of lack of a want of being informed by ancient philosophy. Okay, so like, I don't know, like we get kind of obsessed with the findings of science. We talk a lot about whether, I mean, the most foundational religious question probably is what sort of causes everything? Like what is the reason why anything exists? Why is there something rather than nothing? And if you ask that question today, like why do things exist? What is the cause of their existence? Instantly people will be thinking temporally. They'll be thinking about sort of going back in time. And if you say, well, I think that sort of everything needs some kind of cause, the way that people are picturing that in their head is like one cause comes before another, and that comes before another, and that comes before another, and that sort of goes back in time. And so somebody will say like, oh, but maybe like this chain of causation just sort of goes back infinitely, you know? And then you don't need God, right? Because God is supposed to be the first cause, and if there's just this infinitely long chain of causes back into the past, then we don't need a first cause. And it can be kind of astonishing to people to learn that even the people who are most famously associated with causal arguments, like Aquinas, did not believe that you could philosophically establish that the universe had a beginning. He quite explicitly says the universe could have gone back forever. He believes because of revelation from God that it had a beginning, but philosophically he's like, the universe could have gone back forever, and yet it still needs a first cause. And people are like, wait, what? Like, well, that doesn't make any sense, which is an indication that they've just sort of misunderstood the nature of causation as Aquinas is talking about it. And he's leaning on Aristotle, and he's talking about a kind of hierarchical kind of causation. There's also this view, like, again, like immanence and transcendence. There's this view that if God is going to explain the universe, he's going to explain the universe in its totality. It's like you sort of imagine the universe as a whole, and then God is there causing it, like sort of holding it up like Atlas, you know? Whereas, take like the argument from motion, for example. So Aquinas' first way and sort of relying on the Aristotelian notions of change and actualization of potential. So in the medieval period, when you hear the word motion, it just means change. It doesn't just mean locomotion, which is one of the first ways, by the way, to like figure out if somebody kind of knows what they're talking about with an argument like this. Like if they describe the argument from motion as only what we call locomotion, like things moving around, then you don't know what like Aquinas was talking about. He's talking about any kind of change, by which he, following Aristotle, means any actualization of potential. Whenever one thing changes into another, it previously had the potential to be that thing, and something actualizes that thing. So a microphone falls to the ground, a cup of tea gets cold. Like I had this cup of tea and it's now cold, and it was warm, so it had the potential to be cold, right? But for that potential to become, I know you know this, Joe, but for this potential to become actualized, there has to be something else which is already actual, which actualizes that potential. So the room is cold, and that actualizes the potential of the tea to be cold. It couldn't be that if the room was really warm and had the potential to be cold, the potential coldness of the room couldn't actualize the potential of the tea to become cold, right? It has to be already actual. So for any instance of change, when any change occurs at all, or any actualization of potential in any form occurs, there must be something else which is already actual, which brings it about, right? But that thing which is actual, if it itself is in any way like a possible thing or has any kind of potential which was actualized, it has to be actualized by something else, and that has to be actualized by something else, and so on and so forth. And so at the basis of all of this, there must be some kind of thing which can actualize everything but doesn't contain any potential. Because if it contains any potential itself, then there must be something else which is actualizing its current state. So it has to be an unactualized actualizer. It has to be pure act. It can't have any potential. It has to just be pure act all on its own, right? And this is your kind of Aristotelian argument for God's existence. There is some foundational, like, being with absolutely no potential, which is pure act, which brings everything into existence, or actualizes all instances of change. So then there are a bunch of questions. Okay, what's the nature of this thing? Well, Aquinas says it can't be physical, can't be material, because material objects inherently have potential. If something's made of material, I could divide it in half, for example. or I could move it over here. Like, just to be physical means it has some kind of potential. Because we're talking about pure act, can't be physical. Okay, so you've got a non-physical actualizer. There can only be one of them. Why? Well, because to distinguish between one thing and another, you need some metric by which to distinguish them. It needs to be bigger or smaller, or one's over here, or it comes later in time, or something like that. But none of those concepts apply to pure act itself. Otherwise, you'd be giving it potential, so it can only be one of them. Okay. Anyway, the reason I'm bringing up this argument is not to just run the argument, but is to say that people then have this idea in their head that you need the unactualized actualizer to explain the universe. No. We haven't talked about the universe. I haven't even mentioned the existence of the universe in this argument. The only thing that I am explaining is one particular instance of change. So, my cup of tea becoming cold. Just for that, you need this thing which Aquinas and Aristotle, which Aquinas calls God, right? Just to explain the change of this cup of tea from hot to cold, you need God. You also need God to explain the change of, this microphone falling to the ground, or my hair growing longer, or an acorn becoming a tree. You need God for all of those things. But it's not like you take all of those instances of change, you put them all together to give you the universe, and then you say what caused that. Instead, God is immanently, causally present in every single individual instance of change, if that makes sense. So there's this mistake that in order to talk about God as a cause of the universe, you need to zoom out. And then people say, oh yeah, but we don't know whether the Big Bang was the beginning of everything, and we only have the observable universe. Okay, well then zoom back in again and just look at the cup of tea. And from that alone, you've got an argument from motion for the existence of God. So there's this grandiosity which is applied to these arguments for God, which I just don't think is necessary, and I don't think is what a lot of the sort of classical philosophers and theologians were actually doing. They weren't talking about the universe as a whole. Sometimes, maybe, but not necessarily. You know what I mean?
Yes, yeah. Out of interest, what's your general response to the argument from motion?
Well, I think I don't know. I mean, I think there are a few. Okay, so this is where it might get a little bit complicated. But so as you'll know, Joe, the argument from motion relies on a kind of causal chain, the actualization of potential, right? And there are kind of two types of causal chains, right? There's what people might call the horizontal and the hierarchical. You've got a video on this. You've got a video on Aquinas talking about this. But typically, because people love Latin for some reason, they'll be called a causal chain ordered per accidens or per accidens, and one which is ordered per se, which means accidentally and essentially. So an accidentally ordered series and an essentially ordered series. And Aquinas is quite explicit that in these horizontal chains of causation, so for example, the dominoes falling over, right? Or a father causing a son, and then a son causing another son, and then a son causing another son. This is one type of causation. This is horizontal, right? And the distinguishing feature is that each individual member of the chain has its own causal power. So my father has me. My father can then die, and I now still have the causal power to bring about the next being in the chain, right? The dominoes are falling over. If I take that first domino and I throw it in the bin, the dominoes can keep falling over further down the line because each domino has the power to knock over the next one, right? So that's a horizontal kind of series. And Aquinas is quite explicit that those could go back infinitely. This is why Aquinas is even if the universe goes back infinitely. And Aristotle, of course, thought that the universe was infinite. He thought it had no beginning, and yet still thought we needed an unactualized actualizer, because it's only that horizontal kind of causation which can go back forever. There's another kind of causal chain, which is the per se, the essentially ordered series, in which each sort of causal actor in the chain does not have its own causal power and only borrows it in that very instant from the thing before it. So Aquinas' example is a hand holding a stick which pushes a rock, right? So if I just sort of push a rock with a stick, what causes the rock to move? The stick. And what causes the stick to move? Well, my hand. And what causes my hand to move? Well, my shoulder, let's say. This is kind of happening all at once, to the extent that it's not like if I remove and when we say first in this context, we really mean like most foundational. We don't mean first in time. We mean like the most causally prior. It's getting a bit wordy. I hope this is okay.
I sometimes use the term metaphysically dependent, just because like.
Yeah, sure. I don't know. I never know how. I know your audience is very philosophically engaged and much smarter than me, but I'm trying to make sure that if someone's listening who hasn't heard this argument, they kind of are able to roughly follow. If you aren't, then watch Joe's video first and then come back here for my response, I suppose. So, the hand is moving the stick and the stick is moving the stone, right? And the point about this kind of causal chain is that if you remove that first cause, like the shoulder, it's not like my hand just still has the power to push the rock forward. If you cut it off from my shoulder, my hand isn't doing anything. Similarly, if my hand isn't there pushing the rock in that moment, the stick doesn't have any causal power. It borrows it from the hand. And so the rock's motion gets its motion from the stick, and the stick gets it from the hand. It's not like you can throw away the hand like you can kill my dad, and the stick still just magically has the power to push it. That doesn't make any sense. So the problem with this is that this kind of causal chain can't go on infinitely. Because if the stick only borrows its causal power and doesn't have any from my hand just borrows it from my arm, and my arm borrows it from somewhere else, and that just goes on infinitely, then there's no causal power at all. Because none of those actors actually have any causal power. They're just borrowing it from somewhere. It would be like if I within an instant borrowed £100 from you, but you didn't have £100. So you just in that same instance borrowed it from your friend, and they borrowed it from their friend, and they borrowed, and that went on infinitely, but it all happened at one time, in one instant, and suddenly I've got £100 in my hand. It literally doesn't make any sense. There's nowhere for that £100 to have come from. There must be some foundational £100 from which we're all borrowing it, right? Okay, so that's the argument, right? So there has to be some kind of first cause, which is to say a foundational cause, only in essentially ordered series, like per se, causal series. What do they say? Like ordered per se or whatever. Okay, right. So what's the response? Well, one response to me that I think is quite promising is the fact that there's no difference between per se and per accidens causal chains. So one way of thinking about this is that this is where the scientist becomes useful. There is no ultimate simultaneity. Einstein shows that there's no such thing as actual simultaneity. So when I push, suppose I'm pushing the rock, right, with the stick, but imagine the rock is like, imagine I'm stood on the sun, right, with my big long stick, and I'm pushing this rock that's back down on Earth, right? It takes light 8 minutes to get from the sun to Earth. That's the fastest information can get from the sun to Earth is 8 minutes. When you're pushing a stick, the information of like the atomic vibration would actually travel at the speed of sound. So it wouldn't be 8 minutes. I'm going to look it up. How long does sound take to get from sun to Earth? Obviously, sound can't travel from the sun to the Earth, but it would take around 14 years, apparently, according to the Google AI. That's crazy, right? It's absolutely crazy. So 14 years, apparently, is how long it would take sound to travel from the sun to the Earth, which means that when I push that stick and the atoms in the stick start sort of, what's really happening is I'm made out of atoms, and I'm sort of pushing these atoms, and those atoms are pushing the next atoms in the stick, and those atoms are pushing the next atom in the stick. It would actually take 14 years for the rock on Earth to move. That's the fastest it could happen. It wouldn't happen simultaneously, which means that in theory, I could push that stick, and then, I don't know if I'd physically be able to, but in principle here, if I push that stick, and then the stick sort of starts, it's kind of hard to imagine, right? But like the stick would start sort of vibrating and sending its motion down the stick. In theory, once that sort of vibration is happening, I could like chop off the end of the stick. And if I could do that without interfering with the physical vibration of the stick somehow, if it just kind of disappeared, it seems to me that the motion of the stick could just carry on. And so what you actually kind of have is an accidentally ordered causal chain. What Aquinas is describing with pushing the stone with the stick is not actually simultaneous. And if you were fast enough, you could like initiate the movement, chop off the end of the stick, and then the rock would move. Do you know what I mean?
Right, yes.
And so it's not actually clear to me that, and if Aquinas explicitly says that accidental chains can go on infinitely, then if essential chains are just the same kind of thing, then they can go on infinitely too. Okay, so Thomists are aware of this, and they say that there are examples of per se ordered causal chains which are not simultaneous.
Right.
The only thing that you need for it to be a simultaneous causal chain is that, for it to be a per se causal chain, is that each individual member doesn't have any causal power of its own and borrows it from the prior, even if that happens through time. But then it starts to get a bit murky for me, and I genuinely don't know like where this goes. It starts to get a little bit murky for me, because if you say, well, you know, it can happen through time as long as the thing itself doesn't have the causal power on its own. But then I think back to those dominoes, which are like a prime example of an accidentally ordered series. And I'm like, well, yeah, okay, I can remove the first domino and throw it away, but like, I don't know how to think about, like, does one of those dominoes have its own causal power to knock over another domino? It seems to at least borrow it from the one before it, like, as it falls over. That's what gives it the motion. And then when it's falling over, it sort of hits into the... I don't really know how to cash that out. Like, I'm actually genuinely a bit confused by it. So, I mean, if there are any Thomists listening, I'd love to know sort of what to read on this. But I just don't know how to sort of really properly cash out the difference between essential and accidental causal chains and what exactly the difference is.
Yeah, because when I've tried to think about this in terms of coming up with like per se causal chains that don't rely on kind of simultaneous physical action, it's been things like, oh, well, you know, you riding your bike depends on the laws of physics or something like that. But that, I think, is a much more spurious kind of chain to argue, if that makes sense. Like, it's not immediately clear to me that, A, that's the kind of thing that we would like think of as causal. Like, it's kind of, and B, what it means for something to be dependent on the laws of physics. For a start, you know, we start to bring in quite heavyweight notions of what those laws are. For example, if you're like a Humean or even Humean adjacent regarding laws or causation, right? You can be a Humean regarding causation. Hume is really strawmanned when it comes to causation. He thinks that causation isn't a real thing. He doesn't think that like regularities don't exist. But like, if you are just Humean or Humean adjacent regarding laws of nature, then like that just doesn't get off the ground, because there are no heavyweight laws of physics. There is just there are just regularities. Like, the laws aren't a thing. The laws are a thing we use to describe the regularities in nature. And like, you know, then the Thomists can start, as I'm sure the Thomists would, because I think that most Thomists are probably lean quite heavily into final causes, will say something like, you can't get by on bare regularities. The trouble with that is that, as I've sometimes said regarding atheist responses to the fine-tuning argument that rely on like particular controversial theories of probability or something like that, or interpretation of probability, it seems like with theism and atheism, you really want to have as uncontroversial philosophical assumptions as possible. So like, the example of holding something up or the example of pushing a rock with a stick are lovely, because people, at least until information travel was bounded at the speed of light, people wouldn't have questioned the idea that that was a thing that could happen. Whereas, you know, if you're suddenly building your entire philosophical system on having a very heavyweight notion of what a natural law is, all of a sudden your theism is dependent on something that's quite controversial. And that, I mean, you know, to be fair, I think that, to his credit, I think that actually just is what Ed Feser has done. Like, not the natural law thing necessarily, I think that's part of it. But I think that Ed Feser has basically just devoted a substantial part of his theological writing to just basically saying Aristotelianism is true. And if Aristotelianism is true, then all of this other stuff follows, which I think is actually a perfectly sound strategy. I think that is a reasonably decent way to take Thomism. I just think that obviously the whole of Aristotelian causation, including things like final causes, isn't the easiest thing to swallow in a kind of post-Galileo world.
Yeah.
You know,
Well, I think,
maybe
you
it's
know,
right. Like maybe we genuinely can't get by without final causes. I think that it's
yeah,
you don't
I
want to
mean,
build your theism upon controversial foundations.
yeah, final causes. I spent a lot of time recently thinking about final causes, and I think there's something to it. You know, there's something. Maybe I'm just sympathetic to controversial ideas that no one agrees with, but I think there's something going on there. But Ed Fazer, I think, offers an interesting example here. Like, Fazer doesn't, strictly speaking, present an argument from change, because what he does is he says that we all know that change exists, and what change is the actualization of potential. He then says that, like, existence, like when a thing exists, it is an actualization of potential. So, like, right now, like, the existence of me or the existence of this microphone is an actualization of the potential of this material, right? To take the formal cause of the microphone. And he's quite explicit in saying, like, I'm not saying that makes it an example of change. I think that all change is actualization of potential, but not all actualization of potential is change. But he says there's a similar kind of line of inquiry here, which is to say, right now, the existence of this microphone is the actualization of the potential for this material to be a microphone. And that potential, the existence of the material or whatever, has to also be actualized by something, and that actualized thing has to be actualized by something. And maybe that could be thought of as simultaneous, because, you know, existence doesn't travel at the speed of light. You know, it's just what is there right now. But I think a lot of our difficulty in, like, understanding or being able to conceive of these kinds of arguments is our inability to really conceive of what it means to switch time off. You know, like, what that would really mean. I mean, for the Thomist, time is just a measure of change. Like, it's so unclear what time even, like, really is. But, like, you know, the classic example of, like, the holding something up, like, I'm holding up this phone, right? And the phone is being held up by the hand, and the hand is being held up by the arm. And the idea is, well, if I remove the arm or I remove the chair or whatever, the causal chain no longer has the power to hold up the phone. But if you actually froze time, if you, like, stopped time, and then you removed the chair underneath me, I'm pretty sure the rest of me would just stay still, because time has stopped. You know, it takes time for everything else to sort of fall to the ground. Like, we're relying on the assumption that gravity is going to pull it to the ground. So all of these examples, like the holding up the phone and the pushing of the stick, either just don't work, or are actually just kind of like helpful analogies for what is a much more subtle and specific phenomenon.
And one of the interesting things about the time that Aquinas was writing is that at that point, people had multiple notions of time. So I've been reading on my Substack. Nobody else is joining me for this one. This isn't the reading group, because I'm not going to subject everyone to 700 pages of Charles Taylor just yet. But I'm reading Charles Taylor's A Secular Age there. And one of the things he points out is that for the medieval peasant, and indeed the medieval learned scholar, for a long time, certainly during Aquinas' period, time wasn't just our time, like linear time, what they actually called secular time. It also had time, like eternal time, so God's time, which just operated by, like, totally different rules. And I think, you know, had this kind of vertical, hierarchical, metaphysically dependent property to it. It also had a phenomenological dimension, right? So one of the things that that allows you to do is make times that are very distant in linear time closer together. So, you know, Good Friday one year is, it feels to the medieval peasant closer to Good Friday last year than it does to the day after Good Friday. I don't know what the Saturday's called, this year, or at least, very least, the Friday the following week, let's say, to avoid any kind of obvious liturgical difficulties. And, you know, there's this whole kind of other dimension that seems to be operant in the foreground or in the background of Aquinas' thinking here, that we don't necessarily think in terms of. I think there's a really interesting thing to be had here about how to try and get in the head of other people's views. I've been doing, to bring us back to consciousness a little bit, I've been exploring illusionism, which is a view that you kind of touched briefly upon earlier. And if you read illusionists, a lot of this, they'll say things like, I'm not denying consciousness, I'm denying phenomenal consciousness. And I'm so used to equating consciousness and phenomenal consciousness that I kind of can't get a grip on what they mean. Like, I can lay it out propositionally, but I can't yet get inside the illusionist's head to like see the world from their perspective, ironically, to have to experience what it's like to be an illusionist. And that does, that's not a criticism of illusionism. But I find it very interesting, especially exploring these historical thinkers.
So when you become convinced, you could say like, I finally don't see what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm going to say, that this is not phenomenal at all. Actually, it's quite mundane. But this idea of like the extra intellectual difficulty that it takes to inhabit a particular alternative philosophy, like maybe in order to kind of grok. Oh God, grok's like an AI now. Like grok is a term from Stranger in a Strange Land that means to like understand something on a very deep level. And now it's just like the Twitter AI, and that sucks. But anyway, to kind of truly intuitively understand Aquinas' argument, maybe we need to like try and tease out his idea of eternal time. I mean, I don't believe in eternal time, so like it doesn't make the argument any more convincing. But I think it's an interesting exercise to try and figure out how these thinkers would have perceived their own arguments. Like Hume is another good example there, because so often people leap from Hume doesn't believe in actual causation to Hume doesn't believe in regularity, and everything could fall apart at any moment. It's like, well, that's not quite what he means. At least that's not quite what he means with his theory of causation. And I know I think that is a skill that I think that I think we could train to understand historical philosophers, but also train to understand people around us today with radically different philosophical viewpoints. And illusionism has been like my example of that.
It seems
recently.
Clear to me that Aquinas will have answers to the things that we're saying, right? I mean, like, the thing about someone like Aquinas is he's so thorough and so detailed, and it's one of those texts which is, I mean, something like the Summa Theologica or the Summa Contra Gentiles, or however you say it. These are long books, but they seem to be long in a justified sense. There are a lot of long books where you feel like that could have been a lot shorter, and maybe Aquinas could have shaved off a few words here and there, but like he really does sort of go into everything. And so I'm not trying to suggest that he wouldn't have an answer. I'm saying that it's something that I need to work out, and quite right, in order to see where someone's coming from, you really do need to inhabit their world, because the way that they're using the words, it's like what Alistair McIntyre talks about in After Virtue about our use of ethical terms. It's like maybe we just mean so many different things by the words that we're using that you just need to get inside of the heads of these people. And it's something that I would like to do at some point, but I don't know if I have it in me, because it's a lot, and it's difficult to know where to place your attention. But it seems to me that Aquinas is celebrated for a reason.
Fantastic. Well, and just to kind of wrap this up, what do you think, on your estimation, is the best idea that you encountered in the last year?
Gosh, man, the best idea that I've encountered in the last year. I mean, okay. Okay, so I want to say, like, split brain stuff. I've actually been thinking about split brain stuff for longer than a year. But in the past year, I've really begun to try to consider the implications of the hemispheric, like, lateral divide of the brain for senses of self, for personhood, for consciousness, for that kind of stuff. I can't exactly give you an idea there. Like, I'm working my way through McGilchrist's The Matter with Things, and his sort of magnum opus 2-volume, 3-part philosophy. And he sort of says, like, look, I can't really tell you what I think. I kind of just have to take you with me. We're just going to sort of walk through some stuff. We're going to stop here and there to look from some vantage points, and hopefully by the end you'll kind of get what I'm driving at. I think he's driving at something really important. So the significance of the hemispheric divide, which has got, I mean, if most people agree that our brains are like the center of our conscious experiences, whether the brain produces consciousness or not, the brain is like where it all happens. The brain is where sort of we, if we are anyway, where seem to sit. And the fact that there are like 2 of them, like consistently, that every single nervous study we've ever studied has an asymmetrical divide. Even like nematodes with like 308 neurons have an asymmetry in them. There seems to be some deep evolutionary reason to keep them separate, to the extent that when the brain grows, the corpus callosum doesn't grow. So the corpus callosum actually, relatively speaking, shrinks as the brain evolves. Like, it seems like that there's a really good reason to keep them apart. Mammals are the only creatures that have corpus callosum. Other animals just don't even have that connective tissue. That's got to mean something. And the fact that the brain is like the center of like everything we ever experience ever, the center of thought, of experience, of love, of passion, of art, of music, the fact that there are two of them that seem to be in like this kind of symbiotic relationship where sometimes they rub up against each other and sometimes they work together, that's got to be like so significant, right? The fact that like our very center of experience is like dualistic, is like there's like this duality of the way that we attend to the world. That's got to mean something. And I the reason I want to work through the rest of the matter with things is because I want to try and unlock what that significance is. So there's that. Outside of that, I think Kastrup's attack on materialism was quite important to me. The view that like phenomenological stuff comes first. Like I've got a book. This is Waking Up by Sam Harris because I just had him back on my show.
Mm-hmm.
And like I have an experience of it. I see it. I touch it. I hear it. Right? It's all experiential states. And I've got an AirPods case here, and I can like be like, oh, this one feels like it's kind of more. It's harder to move than this one, and you know, this one appears to me it takes up more of my visual field than this one does. And these are all experiences. But then we start mathematizing them. We start putting labels on these experiences. So I call that thing. I call it weight, and I give it the mathematical language of like kilograms. You know, I measure the phenomenological experience in kilograms. So kilograms is a quantification of the quality of how I'm experiencing the world. And yeah, like this one, like it's got sort of this thing which I'm going to call length. I'm going to call it centimeters. And so we start with the experience and then we put mathematical labels on them. And then for some reason, what we've done is we've like said, actually, at some point we just suddenly flipped and we're like, no, the thing that really exists, the thing that's foundational is the label, is the maths, is the kilograms, the centimeters, all of that kind of stuff. That's the stuff that really exists. And my experience of it is somehow like emergent of it. Like what? I mean, if you actually track the likely historical story, the mathematical description of the world is emergent of the experience that you're having, you know? And so Kastrup thinks that we sort of flipped it on its head. And I think that's a really interesting idea. Like he says that we're drawing a map of a mountain range and like clearly we're just trying to like describe the mountain range in a useful way. And then at some point we've just suddenly decided that actually the thing that really exists is the map. And the mountain range must somehow emerge out of the map. And you're saying that while you're stood on top of a mountain. It just, I don't know. I think there's something in there. I mean, we didn't get into that. We said we might talk about that. But I mean, I think that's interesting. Not to say it's, foolproof or anything, but I can't remember the exact nature of your question, but whether it's the most interesting or important or whatever. But that's been, earth-shattering to me, is to just try to really get to grips with what it means to be experiencing the world phenomenologically first. Those are two things that come to mind, I think.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much. And, you're a guest on my show today. Later this year, I'm going to be a guest on your tour, which would be really, really nice.
Yeah, come along, people. We're going to be in Manchester together on stage. It's going to be good fun. I can't remember which date. It is the 2nd of March. 2nd of March at the Aviva Studios in Manchester. So if you are anywhere near 0161, get down. It's going to be fun. It's the only show you're joining me for. I'm going on tour.
Yes, yeah.
And it's the first time we've ever been on stage together in like a ticketed event, just the two of us anyway. We've spoken at the same events and stuff, but it's the first time we've ever done this. And if it goes horribly, it might be the last time. So make the most of it, grab your tickets.
Yes,
I think it's going to be great fun.
The
really
one and only chance to see us make complete tits of ourselves on stage.
Yeah,
so
come along. Come along, people. I'm sure that if Joe remembers, he'll put the link in the description. Get your tickets. It'll be fun.
Right. Alex O'Connor, thank you so much for coming on, and we should do this again soon.
Let's do it, man.